right, welcome in everyone. Thank you very much for joining us virtually here at the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee. I see a couple people still filtering in into the webinar here. So as we all join in, let me start with a couple introductions and housekeeping notes here before our esteemed speaker begins. First of all, we're so glad to be here, especially some of you may know, or this may come as a surprise, on reopening day of the Parthenon after our major HVAC renovation. So it holds true. We are the only Parthenon in the world with air conditioning, now new and improved, thanks to Metro Nashville Parks and Recreation. I'd like to thank a couple organizations for sponsoring tonight's program. The Archaeological Institute of America, specifically Nashville Society of the AIA, as well as Centennial Park Conservancy, without whom tonight's program would simply not be possible. Tonight's virtual symposium will last for approximately 1 hour. It will include a presentation and time for questions at the end. You're welcome to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or the chat function as well. And I will be issuing questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. Let me confirm we have enabled closed captioning. Yes, I can see it. So you should be able to show or hide captions on your screen as you prefer. One more special shout out from the Archaeological Institute of America. They awarded tonight's talk a special lectureship, the Ellen and Charles S. La Follette Lectureship for a Local Society. Longtime supporters of the AIA, Charles and Ellen La Follette, became involved because of their daughter, Letitia La Follette, former AIA president and professor of art history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. The La Follette served on the governing board as general trustees, the development committee, the Development Finance and Investments Committee. You get the picture. Great friends of the AIA. And the AIA greatly appreciates the time and service they have devoted through leadership efforts with them. So there are 3 La Follette lectures annually. One is in San Francisco, one is with the Western Massachusetts Society, and today Nashville is the lucky recipient for the Charles and Ellen La Follette Lectureship. Now let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Jackie Murray is an associate professor of classics at the State University of New York at Buffalo. She is a scholar of ancient Greek language and literature, an excellent speaker, if I might add, from personal experience. And she especially studies Hellenistic poetry and its influences on literature of the Roman imperial period, with additional research interests in race studies and the classics, and the reception of classical literature in African American and Afro-Caribbean literature. She's the author of Apollonius's Argonautica and the Poetics of Controversy, and co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to Classics and Race. She's currently working on several projects, a text and commentary of Apollonius's Argonautica, Book 2 for Cambridge University Press, a project on race and slavery in Plato's Republic, co-authored with David Kaufman, and Becoming the Ibis, Apollonius, Callimachus, and the Dynamics of Illusion and Reception for Harvard University Press. She's the recipient of prestigious fellowships and awards, including the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, the Lord Byron Medal, the American Academy on Berlin, the Titus Fellowship, and the American Academy in Rome. She received her PhD in classics from the University of Washington, an MA in classics from the University of Western Ontario, now Western University, and a BA summa cum laude in Latin and Classical Studies from the University of Guelph. Dr. Jackie Murray, thank you so much for joining us. We are excited to hear from you tonight. Feel free to start when you are ready.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a great honor to be able to share some of the things I've been thinking about and working on with you all. And I've been down to the Parthenon when I was in Kentucky. We took our students from UK down to to see the Parthenon road trip. So I'm very familiar with it. And I've actually given a lecture at Vanderbilt recently, so I've seen it recently. So in this lecture, I'm going to try to connect the veritable meltdown, especially among white nationalists and political grifters on the extreme right over Christopher Nolan's, I would say very good, blockbuster, The Odyssey, that just came out. And there will be spoilers, not very many, but there will be spoilers. So if you haven't seen it, sorry. So this is the with and so I'm going to try to connect this with the history of racializing classical antiquity in art, but primarily in film, and with the actual ancient ideas. What were the actual ancient ideas about skin color and race? Now, it's my hope that by analyzing this very lively public and academic controversy about the film, we'll be able to dismantle the myth of a racially homogenous white world of the ancient Greek myths and antiquity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trace, first of all, the discipline of classics' own historical complicity in the construction of this white supremacist vision of antiquity and its connection to scientific racism. And then I'll examine how race operates within the ancient Greek world and then in epic in particular. And I'll show that what we're going to find out is that it's not, for them, race is not rooted primarily in physical markers like skin color, but it was more clearly an ideological construct diffused by narratives that justify the dehumanization and the perpetual subjugation of certain groups. And in epic, that manifests itself in the relationships between heroes and non-heroes, heroes and women, and heroes and monsters. So what epic tends to do is construct the racialized other as somehow essentially monstrous. And this is how you then justify treating them without human dignity. All right, so let's get going. All right, so the spark that ignited this whole firestorm over Nolan's casting choices, like the spark that started the firestorm was Nolan's casting choices. So in general, he has a diverse cast, as you can see here, which deviates from the traditional Hollywood casting norms for films set in classical antiquity up until about 10 years ago. Uh, Things changed 10 years ago, and but prior to that, we wouldn't see such a diverse cast. And if we had people of color represented in the classical antiquity, they were almost always slaves or people to be executed or terrifying foreigners, etc. So, and that was Hollywood's norm. So, what has triggered this outrage then is this deviation from what people have come to expect in the presentation of the classical world. And in particular, the proprietor of X has used his platform to declare, in effect, a war against the film, even before it was even released. And it's particularly attacking the casting choices of that Nolan made over Helen of Troy, played by Lupita Nyong'o, and the goddess Athena, played by Zendaya, and the figure Sinon, played by Elliot Page. Get these people there. All right. So we can see then, first of all, the issue with Lupita is, of course, that she is a dark-skinned African, Mexican um, heritage person who is supposing to play Helen of Troy, who is supposed to be, of course, the most beautiful woman in the world that caused the Trojan War by running off with or being abducted by, depending on the version you want, um, by the Prince of Troy, Paris. Now, the outrage is, of course, that has to do with, of course, long established, and we'll get into how they got this beauty standard got established, but long established beauty standards that white skin is superior to dark skin, and so it's impossible for Lupita or someone looking like her to be the most beautiful woman in the world. And also the idea that the Greeks couldn't have imagined the most beautiful woman in the world being of dark skin like Lupita. So that's the first round. Okay. In the case of Zendaya, again, similarly, she's not white enough. And so again, the arguments here is that Nolan is trying to capitalize on wokeness, and he's blackwashing the film. And he's also taking advantage of the fact that Zendaya is a very popular actress right now. And, in many films, she's coming out in Spider-Man next. So, this is seen as a ploy to um, get awards. Now, quite frankly, I don't think your job as a filmmaker is anything other than to get awards. So I'm not really worried about that. But what's interesting about Zendaya is that she's actually controversial, not just because of her casting, because of her race, but also because of some of the things that she herself has done, or maybe her PR crew or whatever, her stylists have done, where in at least one sort of a casting call in London for the Odyssey, she wore earrings that were allegedly fashioned from authentic first millennium BCE Iranian artifacts. And so this then triggered a backlash and petitions from archaeologists and academics who raised serious and legitimate ethical and legal concerns regarding the provenance of antiquities, the private trade, and the potential looting of cultural antiquities, especially with the current war that's going on. Um, so again, she's controversial both on the left and on the right. But in her case on the left, it has a lot to do with can you just use other people's antiquities as you will, but which does have a similar have a resonance with what we're talking about in this lecture. Anyway, and then there is the figure of the actor Elliot Page, who plays the figure Sinon, who actually is not in the Odyssey, but comes from the Aeneid and Dante's Inferno. And he's, of course, the figure that tricks the Trojans into taking the horse into their city, and that's how the Greeks then are able finally to get inside the city and take the city by violence. So as soon as it was announced that Elliot Page, who's a transgender actor, was in the movie, rumors spread that, oh dear, Nolan has cast a transgender person as Achilles. So transphobic and right-wing circles in the manosphere manufactured a viral false rumor claiming depicting and images depicting Elliot Page as Achilles, dropping his shield and whatnot, and of course generated through AI and trying to imply castration and all this kind of stuff. Now, what's interesting is that while, of course, Elliot Page does not play Achilles explicitly in the film. Elliot Page, he plays Sinon, and but the way in which Nolan has sort of shuffled the deck in terms of the themes of the Odyssey does replace Achilles in the underworld scene with Sinon. So that's actually a legitimate observation, and it's an interesting one because then it makes Odysseus's interaction with this hero from the underworld more directly related to um, his own behavior in the Trojan War. Now, what the right seems to be completely oblivious of or willfully ignorant of is that Achilles is actually one of the queer characters in antiquity. Um, his relationship with Patroclus in the Iliad, in antiquity, everyone understood that relationship to be homoerotic, that it was a male love relationship. So that should also freak out these people in the manosphere, but they pretend that they don't know that. And also, they also pretend to ignore the fact that Achilles actually spent a good portion of his life as a girl on the island of Skyros, where his mother was trying to hide him from, participating in the Trojan War. And so she had him dress up as a girl and live as a girl on this island of Skyros. And it is during his stay on Skyros, he falls in love with Dea, the princess of the king there, and the two of them have a sexual relationship and produce Neoptolemus, his son, who is actually the conqueror, ultimate conqueror of Troy. So the right is picking and choosing where they want to freak out about. If Elliot Page were in fact playing Achilles, it would actually be a great casting if you're going to try to follow what the ancients understood about Achilles. So let me move to the next slide. All right, so now all of this is not even remotely unpredictable, and it's kind of exhausting by this point. Um, as I said, up until about 10 years ago, the idea of casting um, non-white characters in these roles was kind of not done in Hollywood. There was the wonderful moment in 1997 with the Amanda Sante Odyssey, where they cast Vanessa Williams, beauty queen, as Black beauty queen as the goddess Calypso, and then that was actually taken up in other iterations in cartoon versions, etc. So that was, but that didn't create a flare up. Um, but in in the last 10 years, we could say where more extremist views about race have been given sanction and free license to express themselves, then we're starting to see more backlash against these castings. So in 2018, the BBC had their miniseries, Troy, The Fall of a City, and in it they cast again non-white actors. In fact, two African descent actors, one David Gayazi to play Achilles, and Hakim Kai Kasim as Zeus. So that blew up out of proportion again, and it has a lot to do with, of course, the right and the manosphere's obsession with a sort of hyper masculine Achilles and Zeus, but particularly Achilles. So Zeus, they want to ignore the actual accurate ancient understanding of Achilles as a queer figure. And at the same time, they can't handle the possibility of the representation of Achilles as anything other than a white male. And so some of the online extremists at that time thought this casting of Gayazi and Kai Kasim as uh, evidence of their great replacement xenophobic theory there. Now, what's interesting then is that, as I said, these flare-ups are predictable, um, and they indicate a glaring double standard about who can be depicted or who can depict a hero or heroine, god or goddess, in a film about classical mythology. We don't see any films that depict the actual Black heroes in antiquity. For example, there's no call to show a representation of the Iliad where Memnon, the Black king from Ethiopia, is figured. So we don't depict Black heroes, and we don't like Black heroes or Black actors depicting Greek heroes. So in 2004, when Brad Pitt played Achilles in the Troy movie, nobody freaked out or made any waves about his casting. And in fact, in recent decades, in this recent decade, as I said, his portrayal as Achilles has been held up as this icon of the far right manosphere, perfect guy. And of course, they're ignoring, as I said, all these other features of the mythical hero. And as I'll discuss a little bit later, it's interesting to bear in mind that the Greeks most likely would not, ancient Greeks that is, would not have imagined Achilles like Brad Pitt. Neither would they have imagined him like Gayazi, but they would not have imagined him as a blonde man with fair skin because of how they saw themselves in the ancient world. So it really begs the question, why is one casting of Achilles, that is the Brad Pitt one, celebrated and treated as if it were accurate, while the other is treated as if it's some attack on civilization itself? Okay. So this brings us to talking about, well, what is race? Now, most of us, the common understanding of race, as it's used in common parlance and everyday talk, is we're talking about people's skin color, how they look, or maybe their cultural identity. So we can say people are being racialized as Mexican or as Muslim or Arab or whatever. So there's some sort of, in common ordinary conversation, race is whatever people are identified based on their heritage and descent, and a lot to do with what they look like, right? And this is a narrative that was developed, not surprisingly, in conjunction with the that justification for slavery. Now, in antiquity, slavery was not necessarily taken for granted as okay. We can tell from the way philosophers like Aristotle or Plato talk about slavery that there were debates about who could be enslaved. Who should you enslave? Should you even enslave people at all? Again, another sort of myth is that, in antiquity, they didn't really worry about whether or not it was okay to enslave people. They did worry. They did see it as problematic. And so Aristotle, in his Politics, is famous for coming up with a justification for enslaving other people, which is the natural theory of natural slavery, which is not very particularly logical, but because he's trying to justify slavery, but he doesn't really want to say any specific people are the natural slave. He wants to leave it open that basically anybody that's not Greek can be enslaved. He's also attached to, he's worried there too if he were to cling on to physical features, which is interesting that Aristotle doesn't actually say, oh, people with these physical features are the natural slave, which would have been the easiest, if they thought about it that way, that's the obvious route to go, but they didn't. Partly because, of course, anybody could be enslaved. They didn't really think about that. But also because Aristotle, being from Macedonia and from the northern Europe, actually phenotypically, physically fit the ancient idea or sort of stereotype of a slave. So, and we'll talk about it a little bit later here, but basically, in terms of physical features, what Greeks identified as the slave, and we know this from the depictions of people in plays, the masks that they wore, and everything, that the slaves were Scythians or Thracians, and therefore Northern Europeans, so with fair skin, fair hair, light eyes. So Aristotle, being from that particular region, probably looked like that, and therefore didn't want to talk about physical features since his might have fit into that. That's something to bear in mind. Now so as I said, Aristotle did not connect slavery, natural slavery, race, which I connect to slavery, with physical features. But in the 13th century, Albertus Magnus developed Aristotle's theory to actually make it about physical features. And the reason why he's doing that is because in the 13th century, so this is before the discovery of the New World, so-called, the church was having problems with justifying slavery, both economically, both morally, and most of the slaves that they were getting were coming from the Black Sea, therefore Caucasian, and literally Caucasian from the Caucasian region. And the church and the politicians and everything were they're having trouble justifying slavery as they're trying to spread Christianity to the world. You have on the other side, you have the Muslims who are spreading their religion, and their religion actually frees slaves, whereas their religion has it that you don't enslave other Muslims, whereas Christianity seems to be willing to enslave everyone, and so the church is sort of trying to readjust their doctrine, and so they have a problem because on the one hand they still want to have slaves, but on the other hand they have a problem with it morally. And so Albertus Magnus, who is a monk, he comes up with a way of planning that out, which is since now we're starting to get African slaves trickling into Europe, he then develops the idea that, oh, well, black skin and the features that identify Africans, this is the natural slave. So this is our where we get the first inkling of the idea that there's a race of black people. And he refers to them as the Ethiopians, but then this becomes more derogatory terms later. But the point is that now in the sort of intellectual history and consciousness is this idea that Aristotle's natural slaves really are the Africans, particularly the folks who are from sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the slaves are actually coming from. So we're retrojecting our justification for what we're doing is basically what's happening. And so then by the 19th century, all of this gets systematized into what we're more closer to what we're more familiar with, which is a bio-racist idea. So in the 19th century, we get this what you have the image here on the screen of this sort of classification of races. Sometimes they'll put Malay people in between and Asian people in between, but the basic anti-Black structure is set up. And you'll notice that this is um, tied up with aesthetics. So notice that the head for the ideal white male is the head of the Belvedere Apollo. And this is connected to an earlier um, aesthetic theory by Winkelmann, who is sort of the father of our ancient art history, who basically had a racialized concept of aesthetics. So he believed that white was the most beautiful culture. He's again a German, so he's from this Northern European location. And so basically, the somatic features of non-Europeans and were to him closer to the bodies of animals. In the case of Asian people, like cats, and the case of Black people, like apes. So this is in 1764, he wrote this in his art history, um, theoretical art history, and then this gets taken over later by the race scientists as part of their narrative. And all of this is, of course, all to justify why we're having slavery, um, and why we have Africans as our slaves, and as more and more people, like in the British colonies and French colonies and Spanish colonies, are abandoning slavery as a production mode. Um, in America, being one of the last places to continue slavery, the arguments about white supremacy become more and more built into the social fabric, right? And being that we're in Tennessee, you guys are in Tennessee, and I was living in Kentucky, we're all very familiar with the Civil War and how that went down, and and the rise of Jim Crow, and all of this is all based on an idea about race that tries to naturalize the attempt to permanently keep Black people either as slaves, and if that's not possible, then as subservient workers based on their quote unquote natural um, uh, inferiority. Okay. So that's the story that we in the modern world have told, and some people continue to tell about what race is. Now, in antiquity, they didn't tell that story. That's not the story that they told. I already mentioned that Aristotle already was a little, dodgy about using physical features as a way to identify the natural slave. Now, he's happy to use what he considers intellectual features um, as a way to identify the natural slave, but not physical features. And so this is how, in the modern narrative, then Black people who are the natural slave on the physical features side also are considered intellectually inferior because Aristotle already told us that, right? So these things get married. Okay, so that's the idea of race as an authoritative narrative. And what I want to say about Epic is that Epic presents an implicit or implicitly presents another of authoritative narrative about race that's completely different from what we recognize, but it is still a racist narrative, right? Um, And why is that the case? Well, in fact, because there are slaves in that world, and also the way in which certain peoples, groups of people, are dehumanized and treated with impunity, that suggests that race is going on. All right, so let's move on. So, one of the ways in which I like to approach race and ethnicity is think about it more in terms of um, differences, right? So, this is a quote from Adolph Reed in his class notes where he says, I said that race and ethnicity are simply categories of social hierarchy, right? And they are just labels of different magnitudes of distance from the most desirable um, status on a continuum of okayness. So the and here I have in the next slide I have uh, yeah, there we go. So here, I don't know if it's right enough, but here's how I look at the continuum. So you have these two poles where you have the same people who are like you are in your race, and then people who are in the middle are, more okay races or ethnicities that are close, and then you have the folks who are completely different and are inferior race. And so usually in America, this is a black and white binary, and other racial groups are sort of in between or on either side. But the point is that it really has a lot to do with um, looking at other people as so different from you that you don't see them as having the same inalienable humanity. That their humanity can be alienated, or they don't even have enough humanity that warrants them proper burial, that warrants them proper living conditions, these kinds of things that we think of as just normal for what counts as human dignity. So slavery then is a condition of dehumanization that is justified by a narrative that says that these people are not, they don't have a full inalienable humanity, and so we can enslave them. And so, however we justify that is going to be the narrative. All right, so now let's look at so what we see in terms of what I've been talking about then is this description of race we understand based on skin color, and then this is then projected and with not with a lot of complicity from the discipline of classics and archaeology and art history and the disciplines that we're in, at least I'm in. In terms of inventing this myth of the ancient world being a homogeneous white world where there were no Black people to speak of, certainly not in any positions of authority or praise. If anything, they were slaves. And you can see that this is a vision that comes out of the 19th century, in particular, in the United States, where Jim Crow is developing as a way of thinking, right? Where races should be separated. Eugenics is becoming a thing. So we want to keep the races separated. We can't have race mixing. We can't have ideas of races being equal. And we can't imagine that this was ever different. So the idea is that this was always the way it was, and so we need to project this back into the foundation of Western civilization, that is the Greek and Roman classical world. And so we start to see this tends to happen. And what happens then is this false aesthetic racial hierarchy is also inherited by 19th century, in the early 1900s, when cinema comes into being. And Hollywood then bakes these exact biases into the DNA of the representation of classical world. So I call this the celluloid antiquity. And so what we're kind of seeing here with Nolan is his clash with this image of the celluloid antiquity. We're no longer in the celluloid era, we're in the digital era. So in the last, so, we have different Odysseus's. We always see Odysseus as played by a white male. So we have Kirk Douglas. This is recent. Like there are many others, but I picked these ones. Kirk Douglas as the 1960s, 50s version. And then you have uh, uh, Matt Damon, um, and he's opposite. I can't remember the name of that actor right now, but the actor there, he plays Odysseus in the Troy movie. So, and then we have Ray Fiennes in the most recent, before Nolan, The Return, where Ray Fiennes plays Odysseus as well. So Odysseus is consistently presented as a white male and often with blonde hair. Now, this is particularly problematic if you're actually going to argue about, as they do, um, accuracy, right? When we read the text of Homer in Greek, we find out, to many people's shock and awe, that, wait a second, Odysseus actually has black skin as his normal state of affairs. Melanchroes is the color, is the word color term there. So he's dark skin and curly hair. And he's compared to another dark skinned, curly haired man. He compares himself actually to another dark skinned, curly haired figure. Um, and then when he is transformed into the beggar, he is white with, grizzled and, looks like a beggar. So he's got white skin when he looks like the beggar, but when he is Odysseus, the hero, he's got dark skin or black skin. So you can see there's an issue here in terms of the tendency to cast this hero, who in the Greek text is black, as a white figure, and nobody's losing their minds over this. But if we were to cast Odysseus as with a black actor, everybody would lose their minds for sure. There's no question. I don't doubt it. Now, so in this idea of the celluloid world, what we get is, an adaptation by Hollywood of racism, the scientific kind based on skin color, the Jim Crow, etc. And then Hollywood starts to cast the ancient actors, or the actors that are playing the ancient roles, as only white actors. And when there's need to have a black actor that's somehow not playing a slave or a sidekick. For example, there's a early film called Cabiria, where the hero is sort of a Hercules figure. He's a good figure. He saves Cabiria, the girl, and he's supposed to be black, but he's played by a white actor who wears blackface, right? So that's the closest they will do. And then what happens then is black actors, if they're going to be cast, they're cast as slaves, or they're just not cast at all. So this has been the way in which Hollywood has perpetuated this vision of the classical world as a white paradise, you might say. So let's turn now to epic itself, ancient epic, as a storytelling device and for race making in antiquity. So as I said, skin color is not really that important in the way in which ancient Greeks identified the races, right? More often than not, they looked at people in terms of what they did. and what their job was, uh, i.e., were they a slave or not? Um, and so what we find then in the epics is you've got the heroes who operate as the superior race. They're descended from the gods, or so they tell us, and they monopolize all the violence and all the ability to rule, and they can enslave and mistreat and dehumanize everyone else with impunity, and that's the sort of their superiority position. And then there are other non-heroes, and one group in the Odyssey is the herders that are slaves to Odysseus. Um, they're they are not heroes, and so in the Odyssey they can be killed at will, and they are, or they can be tortured, etc. The enslaved women in the Odyssey who get punished by Odysseus and Telemachus in very gruesome ways for sleeping with the suitors. They're a part of the underclass, so they are the uh, under non this what we call a subaltern race of people, and in throughout the Odyssey, there's all these instances that indicate that these people are denied full human dignity. So, for example, Eumaeus, the swineherd, who is the faithful swineherd, he tells a story about how he became enslaved to Odysseus, and he mentions the fact that he was abducted by an enslaved woman in his original household who wanted to get home, and she was using him as passage to get home, and so she and the baby with the pirates slash slave traders all get on board the ship, and she gets sick along the way, and in the journey when she dies, the slave traders just throw her overboard, and this is seen as perfectly okay. In the same way that the enslaved women or girls really that were disobedient to Telemachus, Penelope and Telemachus, and sort of siding with the suitors, when they are punished in this strangulation way that Telemachus kills them, again, we're not supposed to feel pity for, even though we do probably do feel pity for them, but in the way in which the story is narrated, we're not supposed to feel pity for them. They were bad slaves. They could be thrown away, and they should be punished as they are. Now, what's interesting about the Odyssey, though, is that the suitors are heroes. They're sons of heroes, descendants of heroes. And so the problem that Odysseus and Telemachus face in getting rid of them is that they should treat them with the dignity that heroes get. Now, heroes can kill each other. That's the whole point of the Iliad, where they're on the battlefield and they can kill each other. And these suitors have violated the law of Zeus that is touted in Nolan's Odyssey, but basically the law of hospitality. They've overstayed their welcome. They're eating Odysseus' family out of house and home, and they're misbehaving. They're no doubt raping the enslaved girls, and just doing all kinds of bad behavior. So sure, they need to be punished, but they're still heroes. And so when Odysseus and Telemachus, but mostly Odysseus, kills them, they do owe them some sort of proper burial. And in the Odyssey, they get none. They're basically thrown out in some sort of mass grave. The enslaved girls are forced to do the cleanup, and then before they're killed. So this is a problem in the Iliad, or in the Odyssey rather, where heroes can't mistreat each other. But what happens in the Odyssey is that Odysseus actually violates their racial solidarity, we might say. Um, and this then triggers the end of the Odyssey where the family of the suitors come back and create a fight. And then we need a deus ex machina. The gods have to come down. Athena has to stop the fighting. Zeus has to send a thunderbolt. So we can't continue. But so the Odyssey is actually to a large extent about what heroes can do to each other and what they can't do to each other and what they can do to other people with impunity, right? And we see this throughout. And one of the ways in which I sort of like to see the distinction, how we can recognize the distinction, um, is in the idea of, well, on the one hand, we monstrify the people who are the inferior race. The heroes are divine or descendants of the gods, and so they're special. Normal people are not as special, and oftentimes they're associated with monsters. So in the case of the herders, like that are getting punished, they're associated with the chief herder in the poem, which is the Cyclops. It's not an accident, I think, that the Cyclops is also a herder, because the associations between the Cyclops and him being a cannibal and all these kinds of negative images, and the way in which Odysseus is able to kill him and basically survive at the end of it, because um, Poseidon is not too happy that Odysseus manages to make it home in the Odyssey. But the point is that the Cyclops then is this monstrified version of a shepherd, and the shepherds then in the real world are associated with that stereotype, and they're sort of like their inner metaphysic is of a shepherd, of the monster shepherd. And so when they get punished, um, in the case of Melanthius, the bad shepherd, who is mutilated and tortured to death, when that happens, again, we're not supposed to feel too much empathy for him because he is not really worthy of empathy, and he's a racialized being. So in the Odyssey, then, this is how race tends to operate. And to a certain extent, women in the Odyssey, or at least in Epic, are racialized. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are no women that receive a proper burial whenever they are murdered or die. Um, we hear that as I said, the girls who are misbehaving, they are strung up and given very gruesome death. We see women death happening. The one enslaved woman who was thrown overboard, the girls who are strangled to death, and in the Iliad, we know that the women there are subjected to rape, to concubinage, sexual slavery, and they are forced to mourn for the heroes who actually kill their own family members. So their humanity is not particularly recognized. So there's a sense that women are it's obviously inferior to men because of the patriarchal system, but they're also, I think, racially inferior to men because of the fact that they need a man to protect them from the violence that other men, the heroes, will do. And at the same time, um, they they can't they're never shown to receive the same kind of insistence that we see on proper burial in the Odyssey. And the exception, of course, is Helen, right? In the Odyssey. In the Odyssey, Helen is a goddess. And so she is, immune to any kind of problems that other women would have, like Penelope or Clytemnestra or others. Um, and in the Odyssey, um, Helen is the reason why Helen comes back and lives with Menelaus, and he's forced to take her back, even though she caused all this trouble, because she's Zeus's daughter. So she's a very special kind of person, not like the other women. In the Iliad, when she laments Hector, she doesn't talk about how, oh, she needs him to protect her. She talks about how, oh, now people are going to be able to um, besmirch my reputation, etc. So Helen is a different animal in the Odyssey. All right, so then now let's go back now to Nolan's story. Now, what we get in um, Nolan's story is an attempt to sort of break down we saw that we get an attempt to break down the sort of celluloid antiquity. We're not stuck with every character who's of any significance has to be white. We have Eurylochus, who is a major hero. He is South Asian. You have, as I said, we had Lupita as Helen. So we have a very, very diverse cast. So he's definitely breaking down that that worry. But at the same time, his world doesn't have gods, at least not explicitly. Like um, spoiler, sorry. Athena, who we see throughout the movie, um, as we get through, we kind of recognize that she's actually more of a figment of Odysseus's imagination or his trauma memory than an actual goddess. And Nolan in an interview talked about how the gods in his film are more sort of natural phenomena, right? So we hear Zeus thunder, we see the wind, we can see the way in which the natural forces operate, and so the gods are the natural forces that they represent. But as human anthropomorphic figures, they're the only anthropomorphic figure that we see is Athena, and seems to be a projection of Odysseus. Now, that being said, if the gods are not there, right, then there is a problem for a racial hierarchy in his version of the myth that doesn't line up with the Odyssey, right? Because the heroes are supposed to be descendants of children of the gods, right? And so, so his heroes are utterly human, right? And which is a fantastic and I think pleasing shift from the traditional or even the Odyssey itself. And so if you've decided then that the characters, the heroes, are not descended from the gods, then the way in which, say, someone like Helen is played out is going to change, right? And so in the case of Helen, it's really interesting how that is played. It's a little disturbing that the first Black Helen is represented in this film as sort of the victim of a very abusive Menelaus. But it does sort of work in the sense of the way in which that the Odyssean world is so patriarchal and so violent, and with the everyone sort of violating the law of Zeus. If she's a daughter of Zeus, then and Menelaus is someone who violates the law of Zeus, then it seems consistent that being a sort of uh, violent husband toward Helen makes sense. Um, so there's a lot of going on, but there's a way of reading what he's doing, what Nolan is doing, though, um, especially with the way in which the women are cast, quite critically, right? Um, his women are humans, and but they are under this patriarchal world where Penelope is the most expressive about the situation, where she complains that no one recognizes her authority as the queen. Um, she's sort of like a dowager queen with this son who's not quite yet allowed to rule on his own, and she's a sort of toothless dowager. Um, and so the women's power, like political power and agency in his film, is extremely reduced, even to one might even argue even more so than in the Odyssey. But I want to sort of maybe try to save Nolan a little bit in this respect by pointing out that in his world, they live in the world of the Odyssey that he's presented is over, right? As Penelope says to Telemachus in one scene, that world is gone, and so and the new world is going to be populated by people like Telemachus, who still obeys the law of Zeus, who's disgusted at what he sees going on between Menelaus and Helen, who's shocked to find out that Orestes killed his own mother, and presumably it sort of presents this kind of hope of a new world. And then the another final part that goes to this, the way in which Nolan sort of answers the issues that I brought up about heroes killing heroes and not giving them a proper burial in the case of the suitors. So what Nolan does is actually has Telemachus stay out of the fight precisely because the all the responsibility for wiping out the other heroes and not giving them the appropriate burial is all going to fall on Odysseus. And so for Odysseus, his for Nolan's version, he leans heavily on the Dantean representation of Odysseus. In Dante's Inferno, Odysseus is an exile, right? And also Joyce's Ulysses. So the idea of him ending up in exile, that final journey being an exile, that is Nolan builds that in and makes it sort of the sort of conclusion to the vendetta justice that murdering the suitors sets in motion or continues. And so, in a sense, then there's a way in which you can look at Nolan's version as sort of trying to get away from all these this racial discourse that's around the classical world, while at the same time sort of inflaming it, right? By having characters that break the stereotype, and the I don't know what kind of solution there can be to this, other than for people to stop worrying about the race of actors and actresses playing in antiquity. But you get the impression that folks are really invested in classical antiquity and its connection to their particularly white ethno-nationalists are particularly invested in classical antiquities connection to their identity. And so we see that, Identity Europa um, had those actually Stormfront actually used the very Parthenon we're talking at here for part of their meetings. They use the image of the Parthenon for their as their logo. And so, like this claiming of classical antiquity as the sole preserve of white nationalists, of the manosphere, um, it's hard to figure out how they're going to how we can get them to let go of it. Um, but I do think it's important to bear in mind that most of their mythology about classical antiquity being this world of white Northern Europeans, basically, um, is a false narrative. It's not backed up by the stories, and moreover, these are myths, and the people aren't real, as a lot of people like to point out. They're mythical. Um, there are flying horses, there are cyclopses in the story. So looking for accuracy in any kind of way is already part of the problem. So I'm gonna end here, and I'll take questions. Um, that way we have a lot of time for questions. So I hope it was clear enough for everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, Jackie. I know I have multiple pages of notes and questions, but I always try to be patient and invite those of you joining us virtually. Please feel free to use the Q&A box for questions. You can also use the chat function if you'd like. I'm seeing a couple come through, so I'll get started with some of those. The first question here. Let me pull it more towards the middle. Can you talk more about is Odysseus's dark skin specifically referenced in the Odyssey poem? They're remembering that they read the Odyssey a long time ago, but can't recall this.
All that, yeah.
And then would various characters have been imagined by Homer as ethnically Greek or more African, more Mediterranean world? Any thoughts you have on that?
All right, well, let's talk about the first one about the Odyssey. Yes, and in fact, in the Greek text of the Odyssey, um, the word for black skin is mentioned twice. It's melanchroes, and it's in both cases. It's in reference to Odysseus. Now, the issue is, of course, that people translate it in a way in the same with the same kind of problem of like whitewashing the antiquity. So what we find is I think Lattimore will say that he's swarthy or ruddy. Um, Emily Wilson says that he's tanned, which is well, she's sure she's going to change the translation. She told me, but it's the most egregious because it implies that he's white and he just got dark, when in fact the point is that when he's transformed into the beggar, he's going from black to white or dark to light, and not the other way, which is how you would expect in a white supremacist world. And part of the issue why what happens in the Odyssey is that you have Odysseus and this other black character. So there are two black characters in the Odyssey. I don't know if you noticed that. So the other character is called Eurybates, and in the first instance, Odysseus is called black. It's when he's being transformed, and another time is when he's talking to Penelope about Eurybates and how he and Eurybates look alike, and because she asks him, "How do you know Odysseus?" And this is actually the scene, very important scene in Nolan's story where she's got the pin, and so it's a scene where he describes the pin in the Odyssey, and he says, "I saw him, and he was wearing this pin." And he describes him and how he looks just like Eurybates, who is black skinned with curly hair. Now, in most of the translations, they go for this sort of colorism move because Eurybates, they then make him into a slave because he's black in the Odyssey, when the word for what he is actually it's Kerux, which is he's a herald. He's like the guy that tells people that the war is over, or he's a negotiator kind of thing. But um, so they make him into a slave because he is definitely black skin with curly hair. Um, and they ignore the fact that he says that he looks just like Odysseus. Odysseus says Odysseus looks just like him, except he's just a little bit shorter, right? So, what happens then is Odysseus gets to be ruddy and swarthy and tanned, while nobody has a problem translating Eurybates as black. So Eurybates is black, explicitly black, whereas everybody else, but everybody comes up with all kinds of different ways of translating the same word for Odysseus. So that's the issue. So it's again, so you can see how it's like a whole system of unwillingness to see Black people in the ancient world as having any other position other than a slave. And that was certainly not the case for the Greeks. So, in terms of what the Greeks would have thought about themselves, so the second part of that question. So, one thing to bear in mind is that the Greeks focused their attention on aesthetic attention on the South, so and the East. So they looked toward Africa, Egypt, toward Asia, the Middle East, and as saw themselves in this Mediterranean belt, right? So they saw themselves as sort of like a brown people, like middle brown, maybe a little bit. Some people lighter brown, some people darker brown, but they're brown, right? Um, and uh, and so that being, and we have the Fayum mummy cartonnage, so it shows very realistic pictures of the people depicting themselves, so you know that this is what they want to look like, and most of them are brown, like they look like people who you would encounter if you were in Italy, or went to Tunisia or wherever. Like if you went to the Mediterranean, you would encounter these people. So yeah, but the point is too is that the artwork they did, like the early Kouros statue that of the ideal male hero, that is based directly on the Egyptian pharaoh statues. Like we can tell the shape and everything. And again, and also for the time period that we're talking about, like 600, 500 BC, we're talking about the time when it's the black pharaohs who are ruling Egypt at that time. So they're looking at this prestige culture being Egypt, and Egypt is they're darker people than them. They're not looking to the north, and this is really important. They get their slaves from the north, and it's pretty clear, consistent that for men, having white skin sort of suggests that maybe you're a slave. And so this is why in the Odyssey, Odysseus is, when he's lowered status, when he becomes a non-hero, i.e., a beggar, he's got white skin. And so that's really important. But again, having white skin is not the same as having black skin like today. Like it's not the same, because they didn't really see, automatically assume that someone with white skin is a slave, right? Whereas, the way racism, especially, Jim Crow, pre-slavery days, racism worked. If you saw someone with black skin, they were automatically a slave. That it didn't work that way in antiquity, but it was an indicator, right? And it was a stereotype, right? And so we see it in the masks that they have in the plays, and that the faces of the figures are red hair and white faces. So they didn't, if they're gonna not see that, like there's very clear that they don't want to see themselves as white. Like they'll see themselves as brown, maybe even black, but not white. So this is why the Brad Pitt playing Achilles is really problematic, because at the very minimum, he's going to be a fairish brown guy, like a lighter brown guy, right? Not a blonde, Northern European, looking like a Scythian. Not, no, he can't look like a Scythian. right? And then the thing. Now then there's an issue of like women always being said to have white skin, right? In part because women stayed inside, so their skin was lighter. So that's one thing. But I also do think it has a lot to do with the same associations of being in a kind of slave-like person, right? I don't think, yeah, I think it's a gender marker, like it marks women as different from men and, in fact, inferior to men, in the same way that a white pasty um, Brad Pitt guy from from Scythia would be quote unquote inferior to to them. So there is some overlap here. So on the one hand, fair skin is seen as a beauty marker, but beauty, I think, in the ancient concept, that's another thing that needs to be thought about, is the way in which beauty is actually problematic. It's actually well, I'm arguing in my book that it's one of the ways in which the monstrous metaphysic of women is marked, is that they have white skin, and so a lot of the monsters are female, and even Pandora, when she's a monster when she's, and also she's got monsters on her head. Like she's very monstery. So yeah, so I think, yeah, that I would imagine that Greeks look the way they do today. They did the same way in antiquity. Like people didn't really change, I don't think. Um, and so yeah, but I do think there was much more diversity in that world because there was no real concept of a racial apartheid based on skin color. That is a very modern phenomenon, right? Like it's, America, South Africa, this is developed because of our racial categories. There probably was some kind of apartheid, but I don't think it was based on what people look like. So if there's no problem about different people having different skin tones, then surely people are marrying and intermarrying. And so having a black Helen marry a white Menelaus, not a problem. But also, I want to say something about the black Helen issue, because it seems very clear that the Greeks did think that a black woman could be extremely beautiful. So we have Andromeda, again, another example of whitewashing the myth. So Clash of the Titans, where you have the girl that's, chained to the rock and gets rescued by Perseus. Well, she's supposed to be an Ethiopian in the original version of the myth. And so, again, she's this beautiful Ethiopian girl. And then we have Herodotus mentioning that the Ethiopians are the most beautiful people. And Memnon is supposed to be the most beautiful of all the heroes. And so all these Ethiopians are said to be the epitome of beauty, from that ancient Greek perspective. So again, they don't have the same beauty standards that we have, and so to then follow the people who are freaked out today to say, oh, they're destroying or overturning or disrespecting the ancient beauty standards. They're the ones that are actually doing that, because that's not how it was perceived of in antiquity.
Thank you. I was just thinking about how our modern lens can be very hard to remove. And
Yeah,
one of the
yeah.
things we like to talk about here was how ancient Greece was a vibrant and colorful place. And that applies
Mhm.
to more than just statues and buildings and people, that, these new technologies are helping us learn more about the past. And I think even new ways like movies, they spark really interesting conversations like the
Right,
one
right.
tonight. We have another question I would like to ask. It also includes a big expression of thanks, saying thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Can you elaborate more on how you see the interactions of queerness and racialization across ancient epic and Nolan's film? And this question is inspired by thinking about Achilles and how you mentioned the women's racialization as a subclass.
Right. Yeah. So I personally think that in our moment right now, that queer people are being racialized and being created as a new race, particularly trans people, and so that you can they're coming up with some kind all these kinds of narratives that dehumanize them. They refuse to address them with the proper pronouns and all these kinds of things. Um, and and at the same time, is the denial or just blinder on that. In antiquity, there were these very prominent queer characters, right? As I said, Achilles is one, Tiresias is another. And I think in Nolan's, I don't know if Nolan is aware, but to have like the two, like interesting figures there, like Tiresias in the myths switches genders. He lives sometimes initially as a man, then he lives as a woman for a while, and then he goes back to being a man, and mainly because the gods wanted to find out which gender experiences sex better. That was that was. But the point is that he exists, right? And similar in Ovid tells another story of Iphis and Ianthe, where they're one's the girl. I think it's Iphis that's born a girl, but her parents hide the fact that she's and bring her up as a boy. So she grows up presenting as a boy, but then they marry her to a real girl and or a girl. All girls are real. Um, and um, and then Aphrodite intervenes to save her or save them by transforming Iphis into a boy. And so they can be a legitimate couple for the world, for the outside world, right? So in the ancient mythology, there's all of these stories about, characters that are gender queer or sexually um, queer or as I said, Achilles is by far the most iconic mainstream character that is could be held up as a queer icon, and he should be taken back from the manosphere, I think, because of the fact that yeah, he's bisexual, he lives as a man and as a woman or a girl anyway, and as a man, and has so there's that, and so in antiquity. Um, I don't get the impression but I haven't finished researching that particular part. But I don't get the impression, given that Achilles is a figure who has is queer, and Tiresias is also a major figure, like that. The major male figures um, would suggest that queerness is not an issue as far as the construction of race. Um, that's not something that the Greeks worry about. Like the Romans, that's a different animal, right? Like the Romans have their own culture and they have their own attitudes towards sexuality, and so they're going to be a different approach. But in terms of the Greeks, I'm not seeing anything in the epics anyway that suggests that someone who's queer or trans or gay is actually problematized in any way. Like as I said, Achilles is a hero. He's the quintessential hero. He is trans or at least transvestite or non-cis presenting in part of his life. He's bisexual. Nobody has to worry about that. Like nobody worries about it. not in antiquity either. Like, so other than like there's I should say though, in Achilles Tatius, if you want to read about it, it's in Achilles, Achilleid by Statius, so the Roman poet or Greek Roman poet. He's bilingual. Is Achilleid. So he tells a whole story about Achilles as a girl, and his falling in love with Deiodamea, and then Odysseus, of course, comes in and tricks him into revealing his identity and joining them in the fight. And what's great is the book two, which is broken off presumably because maybe Statius got bored, but book two is Achilles, amping up how masculine he is. It's like, oh, and I wrestled lions and tigers all before, because he's got to justify why he was found in a mini skirt when they came up to him, right? But it's all very tongue in cheek. It's not any kind of denigration of the hero, right? So I wouldn't say that again this use of or this sort of freak out here over Elliot Page's character makes any sense it doesn't make any sense today, but it also wouldn't make any sense even if he played Achilles. If he played Achilles, he would be the perfect character. Like it would be, he wouldn't need to act, one might say. Right? So yeah.
All right, I'm not seeing any further questions come in. So I think on that note, we can head to our conclusion here. Thank you so much for helping us shed more light on this ancient story. I think it's so fun, at least for me, to always to have this curiosity about the past, and movies like the Odyssey can inspire it, and talks like yours can help elucidate some of those questions and help us really understand what life was like in ancient Greece by reading these stories from those times. So thank you so much to
Well,
Dr.
thank you
Jackie
for
Murray.
inviting me. This was really lovely.
Yes, thank you all for joining us in the Odyssey, and we hope to see you at the Parthenon soon. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you're the first to know about all the exciting things happening at the Nashville Parthenon.